this is the video on Dahlia storage, and I'm gonna preface this whole video by saying that there is not one right way to store dahlias. And one of the reasons why I've been hesitant and taken a long time to make a video like this is because of that. Because I see too much, this is the one way that you have to do it. But the reality of dahlias is that everyone is trying to reach the same endpoint in storage, but how you get there is very dependent upon where you live, your climate, your humidity levels in the winter. So if you already have a way that is working for you, all right, you already have a way where you're getting like a 90 or over % success rate in your dahlias, don't change it. Like, trust me, just don't. Like, if it's working for you, then you've won. Like that, then you're good, you're golden. There is no reason to change something that's not broken. Now, if that's not you, I'm gonna walk you through dahlia storage. So what you're trying to achieve in storage is basically mimic what it's like when they're in the ground. So you wanna store between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. You do not want them to freeze. If they freeze, they are ruined, period. Once a tuber freezes, there is zero way of saving it. You also don't want to store them too warm or they'll start sprouting. Then you also want a humidity level that's ideally around 80 to 90%. Now that in and of itself can be really hard to get if you live in a dry climate. So if that's you want to use a storage medium that holds in more moisture and is naturally going to stay damp for longer. So you are surrounding the tubers with humidity if you don't have it in your air. So that comes down to the storage medium that I now use. I use pine shavings. Looks like this. I just get it as animal bedding. I mean, this is used as animal bedding. So this is just pine shavings from an animal supply store. And I use that because I live in a climate where we have 95 or higher % humidity naturally all winter long. It doesn't ever drop below that because we just get rain. I know it looks sunny right now, but we just had a week of rain, and starting tomorrow we're gonna have another week of rain, and that's just what our winters are. So if you live in a climate like mine, pine shavings are a really good option. If you live in a dry climate, they are not going to be your friend. In fact, I would say absolutely do not use them because they will dry your tubers too much. So here they kind of help handle that extra humidity that we have, and we keep it like at a really good place for the tubers. But if you live in a dry climate, you want to maintain as much moisture as you possibly can because you don't have that humidity in your air already. So two good options would be coarse vermiculite. That works really well in my area too. The only reason that I don't use it personally is because I really can't handle touching it. And that's just a personal preference. There's literally nothing wrong with it. I used to use it. The feel it reminds me of like chalk on chalkboard to me. So I don't like using it, but not because it doesn't work. It works great. Coarse vermiculite, I would actually say is a really good overall packing medium to use, no matter if your climate is dry or if it's like you have a really high humidity, because it's easy to moisten lightly and it can retain that moisture for longer. So if you lived in a dry climate, you would want to spritz it a little bit so you'd have a little moisture in there. And if you lived in a humid climate, you could just use it as is, and it works great. Peat is an option you can use in a dry climate if you choose to. There's also a way where you can just wrap tubers individually in saran wrap. The one note I would have on that is that it works really well, but if you do it, you really have to make sure that your tubers are fully dry before you wrap them. So that is one storage method that's very space efficient. But if your tubers aren't completely dry, you can end up with rot issues more quickly because you're trapping in what the moisture that's there. So it works well with a caveat. Now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about how you can store. The container doesn't matter. I use these crates because I have a bunch of them, but you can use whatever you have. People use cardboard bags, people use plastic bags, people use cardboard boxes. These clumps are seedlings, and I store my seedlings on the first year as clumps. And you can tell that I'm not really trying to wash these, so I would consider these to be unwashed. Whatever dirt has fallen off is just what falls off when we dig. But if you look at this, you can tell that our dirt is really quite wet, and you do not want to store when this is happening, because if you store them wet like this, the chance of rot happening over the storage period is much higher. So this is an example of this is too early to store. Now, that being said, far too many people on the internet give you a set date or a set time, of how long you have to let them dry before you can pack them away. And honestly, I find that extremely unhelpful because frankly, it's going to vary based on your climate. If you live in a dry climate, you might end up having your tubers dry enough to store after like 2 hours. If you live in a climate like mine and the rains have started, it might take a day. Rarely does it take a week, which is advice I have seen. And what could happen, unfortunately, if you dry them too long, is that this, if you can tell, like this is really firm. There's no indentation. This is the ideal firmness that you want to store your tubers at. If they dry too long, they will turn soft, wrinkly, and that means that they're losing moisture. And you can still store them when they're like that, but your risk of storage failure will go up. Now, that being said, if they get wrinkly, don't despair about it, because wrinkly soft tubers can grow and often do grow just fine. It's really just that it's not ideal. And your risk of losing them is higher because once the tuber loses all of its moisture, it's not gonna grow. But there's a big range of a really firm tuber and a tuber that's lost all its moisture. And in this middle frame, the tuber's still gonna grow. It's just you don't wanna reach this point, and once it starts dehydrating, it's more likely to reach that point, if that makes sense. So here's an example of clumps that I'm going to store. So you can tell that they're dry to the touch. They're not visibly wet. And there's still a little bit of moisture in this dirt, which if you were really worried, you could let them dry just a little bit longer. But because I already use a medium that's very dry, I'm okay with this. Now, again, any medium that you use is fine. I'm using pine shavings, and with my clumps, I just dump a lot in here. And then I give it a good shake to get all of the medium around the clump. And then I'll top it off. And that's how I store my clumps. So I put these in my cooler, which is kept at 42 degrees-ish. And we have a 95% humidity in there, again, because it's our natural humidity. But if you didn't have that, often basements can work really well. Garages can be a good option. Any place where, if you have a root cellar, that's like the best. But any place where your temperature range is really between 40 and 50 degrees, it's more important that it doesn't drop into like the mid-low 30s than if it might go a little higher than 50 degrees, because your dahlias can come back from getting a little too warm. They're not gonna come back if they freeze. So if you have to err on the side of being a little bit too warm versus too cold. Now, the downside of storing as clumped is that's gonna take a lot more room than if you store divided. Generally, I would say, having done this a few years, that divided tubers will take 2/3 less space than storing as clumps. But storing as clumps is really easy. And if you're just growing for yourself, you don't have to divide these down to individual tubers, which is what American farmers do because we sell them. Honestly, if I was growing for just me, what I would do is, well, first of all, I actually wouldn't even dig them because I don't have to. I just dig them every 2 years. But if I was digging them, I would take a clump and I would literally chop it into half or thirds and I just plant those. I wouldn't bother doing all the work of what it takes to get it down to individual tubers. Now, if you want to store as individual tubers and you want to divide them and everything because you're short on space, I personally like shoebox containers. I reuse these, and honestly, you typically can get around 15 to 20 tubers in here depending upon the size of the tuber. So they'll hold more than you think. They also stack, so they're very efficient. I do not drill holes in my lids. Some people do, some people don't. I would say that if you are storing in a place where you expect there to be a more wide change in temperature, so say you're like, it's usually 40 degrees, but we might get up to 60 degrees, like there might be like this 20-degree temperature shift, that's when you would want to consider drilling a couple holes in the lid. And the reason for that is when you have a temperature shift like that, you can build up condensation inside of the container, and you want that to be able to be released on some level so you don't end up with moisture buildup. So what I do when I store tubers in these is I'll do a little layer of medium, and again, I'm using pine shavings, but if you were using vermiculite or you were using peat, that's what you would be using instead. And then you're just going to take your tubers. This is the level of what I store them at. So you can tell, like, it's still really firm, but it's dry to the touch. The cut is healed over. It's not visibly wet. And you're just going to layer these in pretty close, but ideally you don't really want them touching. And the reason for that is that if one rots, then it's not gonna rot the other ones, you know, as quickly. And then once you get a layer, you just put another little layer of your storage medium, and you just keep going until you're done. Now, usually what I'll do is I will store the ones I intend to plant myself in these, just because that way we keep them separated. So once all that's done, I use these tags, but there's many different ways that you can tag. Just make sure you obviously label your bin. You cover it again with your medium, and then you pop the lid on, and that one's all ready to go. That's a little bit of an overview on storage. If you have any more questions about it, let me know in the comments. Again, like, I can't say this enough. The medium that you use depends on your climate. If you live in a dry climate, please do not use what I use, because it is not going to be successful for you if you have a low humidity. It's going to, honestly, it will dehydrate your tubers. Also, if you already have a way that works, ignore this whole video. You've already solved it. You don't need to change it. I really am a big fan of tubers. Are just one of those things where if you have a method that works for you, it doesn't matter if it breaks all the rules that are out there. It doesn't matter if no one else does it the way you do it. If it works for you, keep it, okay? Because the goal is the end result, not the steps it took to get there. And then in terms of ease of storing in Dahlia clumps is the easiest, because you're just digging them. Storing them unwashed, generally there's a higher success rate unless you have really heavy clay soil. And the reason for that is it's hard to make sure that that heavy clay soil is actually dry all the way through. So if you have very, very heavy clay soil, I would recommend washing them before storing, just so that you don't end up with locked in moisture. The other important thing if you're storing a clump is you want to make sure that your stalks are really cut flush with the crown. And the reason for that is that this material is fairly likely to rot and mold over storage. So this would be an example of cutting it flush down. You don't want this type of green material. And when that happens, it gets down into the crown, and then the rot starts where all the eyes are, and it spreads, and then you've lost your whole clump. But again, clumps, that takes the most amount of space, but it's also the easiest to just dig them up, get them in boxes. You can use like storage containers from Home Depot. You could use cardboard boxes. The only real key thing is that if you're storing somewhere with concrete, make sure they are not directly on concrete. Stick a pallet under them, stick a tarp under whatever it is, because concrete will just dehydrate your tubers incredibly fast. This is an example of what can happen to your clump within 24 hours if you leave it on concrete. This will not grow. This is completely done. So whatever you do, do not store directly on concrete. If you were storing in a cardboard box, I wouldn't even put that directly on concrete. I would put it on a pallet, or a tarp would work as well. So when we store in our cooler, we put an empty crate under all of the crates that are in there. I'm just gonna go ahead and show you. So this is our cooler. And when we dig, we dig and divide as we go. So we bring them in, everything is stacked upon an empty crate. That's a potato, because we were digging potatoes. And then over here, these ones are divided, waiting to be packed. These are all on empty crates, because this is a concrete floor. And like I said, the concrete will dehydrate your tubers at a remarkable speed. So all of these crates, there's only one variety per crate. And then these I finished dividing on Saturday, because they're in a cooler that's already at 40 degrees. They take a little bit longer to dry than if I just had them outside. So these will start getting packed on Tuesday, and then we'll pack them through the week into medium. Our planting stock and seedlings. So the seedlings are in the crates at the end. So those are what I'm storing as clumps. these are all seedlings that are in multiple years. And then our planting stock will go over here as well. And then when I have a lot of tubers of a variety, I line these with burlap. People can use newspapers too. And then they're stored in the crates with the medium. And then that noise, we use 2 coolers and a Coolbot, which if you don't know what a Coolbot is, I'll link to the website below. But it basically bypasses the AC unit's instructions and triggers it to think that it's warmer than it is, so you can actually get the temperature in this room down to, I mean, you can even get the temperature down into the 30s if you want with those, which is needed because normal ACs don't normally go below like 55 degrees. So you have to have a little thing that bypasses that, but that's the way that you can build like this climate controlled room with a pretty simple tool. While I'm already filming, I'm just gonna go ahead and give you all a field update because I'm not gonna have time again with all the dividing. So I was watering in my hoop house. I have to turn that off. So last year we moved and there were just so many things that we absolutely had to get done by a certain amount of time. And we could not dig and divide at the same time, which now you don't have to, but it is my personal preference. I feel like it's a lot quicker to divide when you dig and divide right away because all the eyes are really visible. So this is our field. This stuff we've already dug. And then starting about right there, well, where these crates are, tomorrow, Monday, we'll be digging 9 rows. They will all get washed in the field before they go into crates. And then Tuesday through Saturday is when I divide all of those. So I use these, well, I switched to these this year and I really like them. These McCore stakes, and we plant 2 across, and then this variety is vertical, so it's planted vertically. It's not planted this way, like here. It's just planted straight down, and then it ends at the next stake, and then same over here. So that way, what we do when we're digging is you're only allowed, and I settled on this just to eliminate any possible mix-up when you're digging, because believe it or not, actually when you're digging is probably when you're most likely for a clump from one variety to get mixed up with a clump with another variety, because when you dig them, they all look the same. So to eliminate that in our field, my rule this year with whoever helped me is for where a stake starts, you are only allowed to dig up to the next stake. So you're only allowed to dig that particular variety. They all have to get put into their crate with their label before you're allowed to move on to the next variety. So that way, only one variety is out of the ground at a time, if that makes sense. So the way we do it in this field is typically we'll have 2 people digging and then 1 person washing. So each variety gets dug, it gets put in its crate with its label. The person who's washing is only allowed to take 1 variety at a time. They wash it in a separate part where there's a row, so they're washing the dirt back into the row. That's just something I want to do. It's not necessary. And then that variety is put away. It's put on our truck with the label in it, and then you move on to the next one. Hopefully that made sense. It might not have. I don't know. But anyway, so this part of the field is done. Here, all the way to the tree line is what we have left. But we have, currently, if we stay on schedule, we have four more weeks. So we're starting week 3 9 rows a week through the end of November. And we, so far, based off of my dividing speed and like our digging, we should be able to stay on track barring any stuff that makes you fall off track. And then through the week, we cut down stuff. So our whole field is not cut down. We have 6 rows cut down over here. These 4 need to be cut down. And then these ones are being cut down. No, there's not really any actually rhyme or reason to why these ones aren't and these ones are, except that I have trained my kids to help us cut down, and some of them needed to be separated from other ones and for peace. So that's why we have some that are in the middle that are not cut down. And then these rows are still kind of hanging on by a thread. These were the ones that I ran sprinklers over, if you watch my Instagram. Mostly because I was still wanting seed pods. So I'm saving these ones to cut down last because these pods are still ripening. And I'll be able to get some more if I just wait. So I am going to tell people to skip these 3 rows and then move on to that direction just to give these seed pods longer to get. That's a little farm overview of what we're doing right now. If you have any questions about storage, let me know. Or, you know, just questions about your particular situation and like you want advice on like what's the best way out of a couple options that you have. I'm happy to help as I have time. And thanks for watching.